Okay, let's go. So, Miles, can you tell me? I know you've done a lot of research into Black people in antiquity and in royal family and in the nobility. Where are we? Can you show us where Black people are in terms of the royal families, going back a few hundred years ago?
Okay. If I was to go back a few hundred years ago, so we are in the year 2020. So 200 years ago, we're in the 1800s. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the question is, was there any Black royalty in England in the 1800s? And the answer is yes. So you're going to then say, Miles, who is that person and where did they come from? Well, the person we're talking about in the 1800s is a lady called Queen Charlotte. Queen Charlotte was part of the royal family. In fact, she was born in Germany and she married King George III. And so, and she wasn't just a regular nobody. She was actually royalty herself in her own right. She was part of the royal bloodline. And I'll tell you where her bloodline came from. So she was part of the royal bloodline, born in Germany, married King George III, and became the Queen of England. Now, she was mixed race. So she didn't look like, us. She looked like someone who had a lighter complexion. But in today's terms, you would say she looked like, I don't know, Muhammad Ali, that kind of complexion. You know, he had a fair skin color, Muhammad
Yeah.
Ali, or Bob Marley had a fair skin color. she had that complexion. And that was Queen Charlotte. And she is the grandmother of Queen Victoria. So basically, you could argue that the Queen herself, Queen Elizabeth II, has ancestors who are Black. Right? All right. So then you might say, okay, well, but that's only one. But that's not. Queen Charlotte is just not. She's not real because Queen Charlotte was German who married into the British aristocracy. So she herself wasn't British in origin. So where did she come from? Well, her ancestors came from the royal family of Portugal. So the Portuguese Moors, and the Moors were the Black people of Europe. Right, so her family, her royal line family, comes from the Portuguese line. So you've got the Portuguese who married into the German line, who married into the British line, and all royalty of Europe were practically related anyway. They're all related to each other, yeah. And so because the Moors had been in Europe for so long, and they had basically upgraded they basically upgraded Europe and made Europe educated and civilized. The Moors did that. So let's go back to context for the Moors. So who are these Moors? If William Shakespeare was listening and watching this conversation, William Shakespeare in the 1600s, if he was listening to this conversation, he'd write down to Queen Elizabeth I, I just saw two Moors in conversation, and it was quite interesting. So in other words, the Moors look like me and you. We are the Moors. If William Shakespeare wrote it down, I saw Moors, he's talking about me and you, who for people in England looking like me and you. Yeah? Mm-hmm. All right. And so then the question is, okay, so if we are the Moors, how do we become different? And this is where the power of storytelling is so important, to hide things and reveal things. It's in stories. It's in stories. So what story was we told? So let me just give some context for the audience. Just to let you know, my name is Miles and I'm talking to Patrick. And we both come from families who came from a place called Jamaica in the Caribbean. All right. Both of us are Jamaican, what you would call Jamaican blood. We were both born in England, but both our parents came from Jamaica. Okay. So we have that sort of historicity in common with each other. Now, what's interesting is that when I looked at a film called Kunta Kinte, which the character Kunta Kinte in the film Roots, right? That story, remember stories now, that story told this story. That film told this story. It said a man in the 1700s called Kunta Kinte was captured in the Gambia. And then he was brought from the Gambia into basically the Americas. And he was brought to, I believe it was Louisiana or somewhere like that, in the southern parts of the States. While he was in the southern parts of the States, his spirit was broken. because he kept saying, I am Kunta Kinte, I am from the tribe of this, that, back home, from back home. And because he was brought up as a warrior in his own culture, he was like a Mandingo warrior. He had that identity. And when he was brought to America, they wanted to disconnect him from his Mandingo roots and his Mandingo pride. So they kept on beating him out of him until eventually he agreed, my name is not Kunta Kinde, my name is Toby, right? And that was a story that I believed when I was a child was a story of us. That we basically were captured in West Africa, we were brought to the Caribbean, we were brought to America, and then at some point after that, we then migrated from there to England in the 1950s, 1960s, and that was our story. That's what I thought it was. So that's a story, yeah? So if you look at our history, we're going to say, we're living in England to parents who were born in Jamaica who had come from the Gambia, for example, or came from Nigeria, or came from Ghana. That's our story. Now that's one of three stories to explain what they call the Black people of America. Now that word, Black people of America, is a changing word because it keeps on moving as the sands of time move. That label is changing. Because like I said, if William Shakespeare saw us, he would not call us black. He would call us Moor. So the word that's describing us is changing. Okay, so the question then becomes, well, is that story true? And the answer is, for some people, yes, it is. That there were people kidnapped from West Africa, brought to the Caribbean, brought to America, and then their children came to England, went to America, wherever elsewhere. That story is true for one group, but there are two other groups. So who are those groups? Here are the ones. The second group I'm going to talk about now are the people who did not do the Kunta Kinte route. They're the ones who were part of the aristocracy of Europe. And these were the Black people who were part of the aristocracy and the royal families of Europe. And what happened is that Europe went through a shift in their identity. And they wanted to say that Europeans were white and not this multicultural basket that was going on in that time. So they decided to ethnically cleanse Europe. And they basically took all their Black people, what we would call Black people today, but they took their Moors effectively, and they relocated their Moors out of Europe and brought them to the Americas and brought them to the Caribbean. Yeah. And so that's a second group. So where did those Black people, Moors, come from? Well, they did not come on the slave trade. They were in Europe before that. Because you don't take a slave and he becomes the King of England. That doesn't even make sense. So you might say, but half a moment, mate, we just said that in the 1800s, Queen Charlotte came from Germany and her family came from Portugal. Yes. So what's going on? So now I have to jump right back in history, and I'm going to show you one group of Moors and how they came to Spain and Portugal. So around about 500 AD, a bunch of German tribes left what we call Germany today, and they basically came into the Roman Empire and effectively took it over and destroyed it. All right. And these tribes were the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. And they relocated out of the Rhine area of Germany, and they came in to Europe, and they basically settled. They moved around to France, then they went to Italy, then they went to Tunisia in Africa, right? And they basically, because they came in large masses, they were in the thousands, massive tribes of 1,000 people came in, they effectively undermined the whole Roman Empire and destroyed it, because they were warrior peoples. They destroyed it.
Were they white in color?
I would say that they were mixed, because Europe was not, there was no time in history when Europe was white. There is none. There is no recorded history that says Europe was ever white, ever. It never existed. Even today, it doesn't exist. People looking like me and you, Patrick, was here 4,000 years ago in Europe. So I'm going to say to you, you're going to say, come on, mate. Where's the evidence for that? So there is a museum. I live in London, by the way, and there is a museum in London called the Science Museum. I went to the Science Museum and I saw an image of the very first Briton, and he had brown skin and he had blue eyes. Right now, that's a story. That's a
But that's
story.
highly unlikely. Someone having brown skin and blue
No,
eyes.
no, no, no. It does exist. It does exist because, as you know, blue eyes is a recessive gene phenomena. That's a recessive gene phenomena. Blue
I
eye.
understand all of that, but what is the likelihoods of someone having, let's say, skin like mine and having blue eyes?
You can find those people in the Solomon Islands, and that's because they've been genetically altered by interbreeding with Europeans. But if you don't interbreed with a European who has recessive genes, you're not going to have blue eyes. You're not going to have it. So you're talking about someone who's interbred, yeah, with someone who is recessive, and then their children inherit the recessive phenomena from their parents. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. You're not going to have someone who is an albino in Africa with blue eyes. No, they have brown eyes. So I'm going to say to you, the first man, they're calling him Cheddar Man. The first man that they said in the Science Museum, there's actually an image of him with brown face, with kind of a stringy long hair and with blue eyes. That is a story. It's not true, I don't think. It's not true. Why do I say it's not true? Because most brown-skinned people do not have blue eyes.
That's
Most
what
brown skin,
that was
most
my point.
brown, that's what I'm trying to say to you. Most brown-skinned people have brown eyes. And so what they've done, they said, oh my God, we've just discovered someone who looks like a Negro who is the first Briton. So what we're going to do, we're going to make that Negro be a European by giving him blue eyes.
Exactly.
And that's all they've done. They just told us a story to say to us that the brown cheddar man is not a Jamaican looking person like me and you. He is actually a European who became white. I'm going to go one step further. I will say cheddar man, the closest look of a cheddar man would be an Aboriginal Australian. Do you know the look of the Aboriginal Australian? Where you got that
Yeah.
long kind of curly, kind of stringy hair with a brown face. And I don't mean the ones who got interbred with the English when they went there. I mean the ones who were just dark skinned. That
Yeah.
would be the look of the original Britons. They were brown faced, brown eyed, curly haired people.
Mm-hmm.
Which tells me that they were interbreeding with straight hair people. And that's why their tight curls became looser curls.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the first
So
Britons.
let's go back up to let's say King Charles II. We
Right.
understand.
So I want to go back into the time frame. Remember I told you Queen Charlotte was in the 1800s, yeah?
Yeah.
And she was part of the Georgian dynasty, in the royal family terms. She was part of the Georgians. So the dynasty before the Georgians were the Stuarts. And before the Stuarts were the Tudors. So let me give you the famous names of those three families. The famous name of the Tudors was the 1500s to the 1600s. And the famous name was Henry VIII. Yeah. And the last of that line was Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. So they say, the story. That's the last, that's the middle, and that's the last of that particular line. The Tudors. They were born in England. When Elizabeth I didn't have any children, they went to their cousins. So the cousins of the Tudors was living in Scotland. And they were known as the Stuarts. The Stuarts. And the Stuarts left Scotland because they were the kings. They were the royal family of Scotland. So they left Scotland and they became the kings and the royal family of England and Scotland, both together. So that is when England and Scotland got married. Those two countries were separate and they got married because the Stuart king became the king of England. Yeah. Now, who was that king? That king was, he was known as James IV of Scotland. But because there was never a previous James of England, he became James I of England. The same person was known as James IV of Scotland and James I of England. Same person.
What time frame? What sort of year are we talking about there?
Early 1600s. Early 1600s.
Is this the same King James that supposedly translated the Bible?
He didn't translate the Bible, but he commissioned it. So he basically said, look, England is a country with its own priesthood because they separate. Remember, Henry VIII separated from the Catholic Church. Prior to Henry VIII, England was a Catholic country, right? He separated from the Catholic Church and made England a Protestant country. When that happened, they had no Bible of their own. So the next king who took over was obviously Mary took over, then Elizabeth I, and then you've got King James I. Now, King James I says, okay, I'm going to commission a Bible for this country. And he gets all the priests out there, and in 1611, they create the King James Bible.
Right.
Yeah, so that's him in context. He's famous for the King James Bible. I'm going to tell you something, Patrick. I went to the British Library and I got a copy, and I read a copy of the King James Bible, the original book.
Mm-hmm.
That is a work of art. It is not like a regular Bible that you guys will read in church. This book is incredible. It actually has a timeline of all the Bible characters going right back from whenever, going right back to Adam. And it's ridiculously detailed and pretty in terms of its illustrations. Now, it's not completely clear because they couldn't just have one timeline going back, but they attempted to. They attempted to have all of these stories and all these people in the Bible and show you who they were in context with each other, whose dad was whose children, who they belonged to. And that book is ridiculously detailed and it's beautiful. And then you then have the Bible stories. Okay. Now, this book is really a document that must be treasured because it tells stories. And it tells stories at the time of the understanding of the people in the 1600s. Yes? And it was the priesthood who were the keepers of the wisdom who wrote that book. Go ahead.
Yes. Oh, gosh. I forgot what I was going to ask. But anyway, yeah.
So if I continue then. So James I, that's his legacy. He leaves us the King James Bible.
And he was black. That's what I want to ask.
Was he black? Well, I'm not going to tell you he was black. I'm going to show you evidence. And otherwise, there's no point talking, is there?
Yeah.
Because remember, it becomes another story. All right. So before I go there, there is something in the Oxford University. The Oxford University had a image of him on a canvas, like a cloth, and there was a drawing of him. Yeah. I wonder if I can actually find it. And this drawing had him looking like me and you.
Mm-hmm.
He looks like me and you, maybe a little bit lighter. So maybe like Muhammad Ali look, then maybe a lighter person. But he looked like me and you, all right? And he had curly hair, like he was Negro. That's how he looked. Or Negro was someone who's mixed with Negro and maybe some white in his background. That's how he looked. And he was a king of Scotland, all right? So the question is, mate, who was his parents? Who was his parents? Well, his parents, his mother was Queen Mary, and his father was Lord Darnley. Now, Lord Darnley was an Englishman. Yeah, or he came from England, Lord Darnley, and his mother was Scottish. Those two people genetically produced James I. So the question is, which one of those two was black? Because two white people ain't making no black person.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so we don't know which one, Darnley or the Queen Mary, if she was black or not.
So I'm going to say to you, I personally believe both of them had black origins, both of them.
Well, there is a lot of information regarding the Scottish black people who originally.
Let's hold on to that for a second. But I want to come back to that, the Scottish black people, because I want to talk about that in a minute, and I want to focus on the evidence that proves what I'm saying is accurate or not accurate, because you have to go for evidence. Because remember, everyone's told stories, and what they did, they rewrote stories and they confused us so that the future generation would not know the truth. And so let's unravel those stories and then look for evidence. All right. Because when you tell stories, it's just another story. Let's find the evidence to back it up. So we have James the First, okay, and then he has a son called Charles the First. And Charles the First gets in some kind of beef with Parliament, right? And I think he basically wanted to raise taxes, and they didn't want to give him the money because they thought he was bankrupting the country. And so basically there was a civil war. And in this civil war, the champion of Parliament was a guy called Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell leads an army against I think they were called the Roundheads, and they led an army against the royal family with the Cavaliers. These two had a punch up, and Oliver Cromwell's army won. So King Charles lost, King Charles the First lost, and Oliver Cromwell won. What did they do? Well, they arrested King Charles, and then they put him in prison. And his son, King Charles II, or he would have been Prince Charles, but the person who became King Charles II, his son, he ran away. He was in the army too, fighting, and he ran away. And he ran away, and he eventually went to, I think, Holland. He went to Holland, and he was in exile in Holland for a very long time, while Oliver Cromwell was basically running the country. They eventually beheaded Charles I for treason, because King Charles II asked France to help him to get back control of England, right? And so that was considered, if a noble asks a foreign power to attack England, that's treason. So they said King Charles asking the French to help him to take back the country from Parliament, they then counted as treason. So they had him beheaded. So now the King of England is dead. He's been killed. Oliver Cromwell chops off the King Charles II's head. No royal family. So, and his son is in Holland in exile, and he's hiding because they're trying to kill him. They're trying to kill him. They want to get rid of the bloodline. Anyway, so what happens next is that Oliver Cromwell dies. And after Oliver Cromwell dies, they ask Oliver Cromwell's son to become the next Lord Protectorate, which is basically what he was. They wanted to make Oliver Cromwell the king, and he said, no, I can't do that. And he was Lord Protectorate. When Oliver Cromwell's son was given the job to take over from his dad, for whatever reasons, he either didn't have the respect or the gravitas or the skills, whatever the reason, he didn't do the job, and he quietly went away into exile, right? Oliver Cromwell's son. And so a Scottish general, because there was upheaval and then there was like civil war going on in England, a Scottish general said, I'm going to come and help England maintain order. So this Scottish general brings a Scottish army into England, and he brings him into London. And while this Scottish general brings him into London, his army is now controlling everything. The general is in charge of England, and he's controlling everything in London. While he's in charge, he sends word to Charles II, come back. We need you to become King of England, to restore order here. And Charles II, I said, I can't come back because they'll kill me. He goes, no, I'm in control now. I'll make sure you're good. Yeah. So they bring him back, but they have conditions, right? They have conditions. We'll bring you back under conditions. Parliament's under conditions. And so they agreed the conditions before he comes. So when King Charles II comes back, he comes back literally as though he's like the good guy. A red carpet is prepared for him, and he comes back into England. He then gets coronated, and he can become the King of England, King Charles II. Now, what year is this? We're talking about roughly the year 1660s. This takes place in 1660s. Yeah.
And he's black.
Remember, I told you I'm going to show you the evidence in a minute. I just want to give you the context for everything. Then King Charles II comes back to England, and this book here is called The King's Revenge. This book is it.
Yeah.
The King's Revenge, written by
so
Don Jordan and Michael Walsh. This book called The King's Revenge it tells the story. In fact, I'll read it to you. It says Charles II and the greatest manhunt in British history.
Mhm.
Okay, this is telling the story of what happens when King Charles II comes to the throne. He takes revenge on everybody who was associated with killing his dad.
Mhm.
Yes? And so literally half of Parliament gets hanged. He hangs them, right?
Mm.
Whole bunch of people. He was told he can only hang about maybe 20 people. He ends up hanging way more. He was quite vengeful, all right? Because he was angry that Parliament was involved in regicide. Now, regicide, suicide is when you kill yourself. Homicide is when you kill someone else. And regicide is when you kill a king, right? He said that Parliament had no business killing a king. And he ended up having them killed. The ones who signed the document to have his dad killed. Yeah? This book tells that story.
Mm.
All right. So that's King Charles II. He has a wife. I think her name is Queen Philippa. And she doesn't have any children for him. She has no kids. Okay. And so, but he's a man who is obviously very, very fertile. How do we know this? Because he ends up with about 13 children for 8 different women. 13 children for 8 different women.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Now, these children end up growing up in England as part of the aristocracy. But because they're not the children of his wife, they can't inherit the throne because they're illegitimate.
Mm.
Yes? All right. So he has his kids and then he dies. King Charles II dies with no child who can take over. So his younger brother, James II, comes to the throne.
Right.
James II comes to the throne and he's now the new King of England. James II gets into beef with Parliament again and they get rid of him. Yeah, they get rid of him. All right. He has children. King James II has children and they're exiled in France. And they try to come back with the army to take back control of the country and they lose. And so
Mm.
effectively that becomes the end of the Stuart dynasty. So the Stuart dynasty ended up having 4 kings: James I, Charles I, who lost his head, Charles II, who didn't have any kids, but he had illegitimate kids, but no kids with his wife, and then James II, whose kids can't come to the throne. They try to come back, but they can't come back because obviously they're blocked, right? And so what Parliament does, Parliament says, okay, Charles I had some sisters who got married into the German royal line. We are going to go and get them and their children to become the royal family of England. So they literally go to the cousins of the Stuarts, or they're still Stuarts, but they're the female line. So they got a different surname because they carry the name of the father. And so these guys come and effectively into England. And so after about maybe 2-3 of these people, Stuarts from Germany coming back to England, the one who eventually had children and continued the line was the Georges. And George I, George II, George III, who married the Black Queen, are the ones who are basically the next generation after that. Does that make
And
sense?
that's the same generation that we're looking at now. Is that the offspring
Yes.
for
Yes.
basically the queen that is in place now, Queen Elizabeth?
Queen
She's the queen.
Elizabeth is related to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is related to Queen Charlotte. Queen Charlotte's husband is King George. Yes?
Right.
King George is related to Charles the Second because Charles II's sister is the bloodline for the Georges.
Mm.
Yeah? And so they're related. They're related by blood. And so even though they're called the Georges, the female line of the Stuarts is what the Georges are related to.
Right.
Yeah? So they're all related. Anyway,
Mm.
so then the question then becomes, well, you said to me, you asked the question, is Charles II black? When Charles II died, a waxwork image of him was done and was put in Westminster Cathedral. And then that is very first one that was done in the 1700s. That person was a black person. 150 years later, in the 1850s, they redid his waxwork image, and he became white.
Mm-hmm.
So King Charles in the 1700s was black, and in the 1800s he was white. So they changed his image. They did what Michael Jackson did to himself. Michael Jackson was born black and he died white. That's what happened to King Charles's image. Right. So now you're going to say to me, Miles, but prove it. Show us the evidence, because we don't want to hear you talk. Don't tell us another story. Show the evidence. So I'm going to show you the evidence now. I'm reading a book called The Memoirs of the Secret Services of John Mackey. Who was John Mackey? And this book was published in 1733. Who was John Mackey? John Mackey was a spy. He was James Bond of the time. And he was spying on the Stuarts to make sure they didn't come back into England with an army to take back the throne of England, because they were in exile in France, remember? So he was spying on them. He was spying on them. And he wrote this book for the Stuarts, remember the female line of the Stuarts in Germany? They came back to England as the royalty. And he wrote this book for them so that they would know who their cousins were in Germany, in France, who may come back. So this book was written for them, the royal family, and he was spying on them. So let me share with you what he now says in this book. He is describing, in fact, let me just show you the title, one title. Here we go. There's a title called Characters of the Court of Great Britain. Now, if you're a character in the court of Great Britain, a court is the royal society. So if you're in the court, you are a noble person. Yeah, you're part of the elite. Yes?
Yeah.
All right. And in fact, it says here, this book was written to His Royal Highness Prince George, husband of Queen Anne. And Queen Anne was the Stuart that George was married to. So this is why they're part of the royal family. Okay. And a film actually was brought out about Queen Anne herself. So on page 36 in the area characters of the court of Great Britain, on page 36, it talks about a man called Charles Lennox, the Duke of Richmond. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Right. Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, is son to the King Charles II. So remember I told you King Charles had 13 children for 8 different women, right? This is one of those illegitimate children.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It then goes on to say that he says, is King Charles II by the Duchess of Portsmouth. So the Duchess of Portsmouth was one of his mistresses, and she gives birth to one of his children. And during, when he was young, he was brought to France. This boy was brought to France. Okay. And then he left France and came back to England as an adult. But it talks about what he's like. He says here, I'll read it and I'll show it to you. He says, he's a gentleman. He's good-natured to a fault. He's very well bred. He has many valuable things in him. He is an enemy to business, so he hates business, very credulous, well-shaped. He has a black complexion, very much like King Charles. Can you see that down there? And I've underlined black complexion.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the key part of it, it says that he looks like his daddy. This man has a black complexion.
King Charles was black.
King Charles was a black man.
Yeah.
His children were black, which might even tell me that these women he was having children with, they were black too.
Yeah.
Because a black man having children with a white woman would have fair-skinned children.
Yeah.
But for his children to come out very black complexion means those women were black too.
I was asking the question, the Duchess of Richmond you mentioned was one of his mistresses.
No, the Duchess of Portsmouth.
Oh, the Portsmouth, okay. So she would have been black as well.
Well, for her to have a child who is very black, she must be black.
Yeah.
She must be black because if Charles is black, like imagine this, if you get a Nigerian man who has a child with a white woman, that child will come out mixed race. So for the child to come out very black, that must mean that both parents are black. So
Absolutely.
that must mean then the Duchess of Portsmouth, who was part of the aristocracy, she was black too. Okay, let me read something else to you, because you're going to say, "But Miles, that was just a one-off." Come on, mate. You know, having a laugh. Let's look at another one. Remember, he had 13 children. In this book, there are four of his kids are in this book. This next one is George Fitzroy, the Duke of Northumberland, is son to King Charles II by the Duchess of Cleveland, another baby mother. All right. It then go. I'll read it and then I'll show it to you. He goes, he at the end, last paragraph, he is a man of honor. He is nice in paying his debts and living well with his neighbors in the country. Does not care much for conversation of men of quality or business. Is a tall black man, like his father, the king. He is a tall black man, like his father, the king. So now we know King Charles II is a tall black man.
Right.
And here is those words. He is a man of honor, nice in whatever, and underlined here in red is a black man. This is the son of Charles II. And he goes on to say that this, his son, looks like his dad. And this was written in 1733. No, it was written before that, but it was published in 1733. So it's telling you that the King of England, Charles II, was a tall black man. And the evidence is that his children, who he left behind, were tall black people.
Why does it say does not care much for the conversation of men of quality
Or business.
or business? Wow.
Now, it's basically giving you it's kind of giving you a feedback on his personality. They're saying to you that royalty do not like getting involved in business because royalty don't run businesses. Yeah, usually. Yeah, aristocracy, they thought running a business was beneath them. They thought that was kind of, that's what working people do. Yeah, they're above that. Yeah. So,
And it's still today, really, isn't it? Because
of course
what
it is.
does the Queen really run? She doesn't run any business, does she?
Well, if you look at her son Andrew, Andrew doesn't run any corporation. Yeah, neither does Prince Edward. They have been brought up to be different. They don't run corporations. That's for their minions below them.
Yeah.
Let me read you another one. So I mentioned two of his sons. I mentioned to you George Fitzroy, and I mentioned to you Charles Lennox, right?
Yeah.
Let me read to you another character on page 40. This is Charles, the Duke of St. Albans. And it says, is son to King Charles II. And this is by Mrs. Gwynn. Mrs. Gwynn. And Mrs. Gwynn was an actress. So this is the only child he has who was not aristocratic. But because she was a famous actress, he ends up having an affair with her. And she has one child for him, Mrs. Gwynn. Let's have a look at him. It says he is a gentleman, every way de bon naturel, well bred, does not like business. He doesn't love business. Is well affected to the constitution of his country. He is a black man. So he is of black complexion, not so tall as a Duke of Northumberland, who we mentioned earlier, but very like King Charles. So let me show you that.
Yeah.
So I read it to you and then showed it to you. Yeah. Not as tall as the Duke of Northumberland, very much like King Charles II. And he is son to King Charles. In other words, all of his children are coming out dark-skinned.
Yes.
If they're all coming out very dark-skinned, it must mean that these women are black women. So not only is Charles the second black, but the aristocratic women he's having kids with must be black too. This one, Charles Fitzroy, the Duke of Grafton, is the grandson to King Charles II. This is not his child, this is his grandson. I'll read it to you, and it says here, the grandson is a very tall black man, about 20 years old. And he's a pretty gentleman. He says he's a pretty gentleman, hath been abroad in the world, and he's zealous for the Constitution. And he's a tall black man. And he's 25 years old. Can you see that? There.
Yeah.
And that's his grandson. So even his grandchildren are coming out black, which must mean that his kids are marrying black women who are in the aristocracy too.
Mm.
Okay? Now, this is the line of the Stuarts. So now we know from evidence written and published in 1733 that King Charles was black. Not because Miles said it, because John Mackey said it and published it in 1733.
Right. It's interesting how the royalty at that time were black, and then all of a sudden it became someone's idea to picture them as white in history, and then all of a sudden they would actually become white eventually. How did that happen?
Okay. This is where we have a kind of a complicated tale. Now, in the 1600s, England had and this is before King Charles II comes to the throne. Oliver Cromwell has a slave colony in Barbados. And they decide to write some laws to make, and it's called the Black Code. And the Black Code laws are introduced to Barbados as a sort of constitution of how to treat slaves. Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, these slaves are effectively being brought in from Africa. Yeah? And it was just a law on how to, treat them with humanity. And some of it was quite brutal, and some of it was quite, whatever. Anyway, so around that time, they had the Black Code. But the problem was, England had a black king who came in afterwards called Charles II. So while Charles II was on the throne, they had black slaves in Barbados. They had black slaves in Jamaica. They had black slaves in Virginia. But here is the problem. You had black aristocracy running those plantations. You had black aristocracy running the plantations in America. Black people were running those plantations with black slaves on it and white slaves on it. There were both white slaves and black slaves were on those plantations. So what you had was not a case of black and white. What you had was upper class, lower class. Yeah? Black upper class and white upper class mistreated black lower class and white lower class. That's the story right there. And then at some point in the history of America, somebody said, we don't want black people enjoying the fruits of white society. And then the laws changed.
Who was it that made that decision?
Good point. It was a congressman in America, a politician in America, didn't want black people, being able to sort of move up in society and then effectively end up having rights. They didn't want that.
What was his name?
A good question. I don't know the name. But I read it somewhere, and I read it that this would have been around maybe the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s. And then once, I remember, but there was already a shift going on because they were basically trying to ethnically cleanse Europe. Now, during the time of King George, remember the 1800s now. So you've got the Tudors, you've got the Stuarts, you've got the Georges. The Georges came from Germany. Say yes. Remember? Yeah? All right. But they were related to the Stuarts on the female side, related to King Charles I. All right. So they're basically King James I's daughters who are in Germany, a part of the royal family. Then what happens you then have, during the time of King George, I think it might be King George the first or second, but during that time, because he was a king and a prince in Germany, as well as now in England, he decided he was going to ethnically cleanse his people out of Germany, the black people, the black Europeans. He's going to take them out of Germany and bring them to America.
Mm.
And he brought them to, I think it was Pennsylvania. I think it's Pennsylvania. So he moved all of these black Germans to Pennsylvania. Yeah. And a politician and a scientist whose name, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to the King of England complaining, why are you bringing all of these black Germans into America who are, because you bring them in such large numbers, they're likely to Germanize us instead of us anglicizing them. Yeah. And then he goes, also, because their skin is so dark skinned, they're brown, they look like me and you, Patrick. Because they're brown skinned people, they are not likely to fit into white society easily. And he says, and he goes on to say, well, you know, because I'm white, you know, I have a preference for a white sort of bunch of people. So I'd like you don't bring all your German black people, bring the German white people. Basically is what he's saying. Or don't bring so many in, because they'll actually end up making us brown and we'll end up speaking German in Pennsylvania. So that was his complaint to the King of England, to say, don't export all these brown people into the Americas. So that comes to the second point I was going to make, that a lot of the Caribbean and a lot of the Americans have their origins in Europe. They're part of the black nobility and the black people of Europe. And they got exported into the Americas. They got exported into the Caribbean, and their children are there to this very day.
Sorry, you speak about the 1700s. I seem to remember between the 1700s and 1800s, you had Napoleon, who, according to what I read, he was responsible for shooting off the noses of black, like monuments that would depict people with African features in Egypt. Is that true?
That's a story I've heard. Is it true? I wasn't there, and neither were you, but we do know that we're hearing stories. Yeah. So the question is, where is the evidence? Where's the evidence? Now, I always ask that question. Good, lovely story. Show me the evidence. So here's what happens. In the 1970s, there was a professor called Professor Van Sertima, Ivan Van Sertima. Now, Ivan Van Sertima was a brown-skinned man who's maybe you would say he's of African origin and sort of Native American origin, right? So he was Guyanese, he's Guyanese, but his family was like Indian-y, Native American Indian, and African. That combination is what he looked like. Yeah. And he looked like me and you, Patrick, as you know. That's Professor Ivan Van Sertima. Right. So, but here's the thing. When he did some research he wrote a book called They Came Before Columbus. Yeah. And he told the story, another story. He told the story of black people being in America before Europeans turned up. So he's basically saying the Kunta Kinte story of white people bringing black people to America. He's saying, no, they're already there. They're already in America. Okay, we're talking about the nose of Pharaoh, by the way, of the Sphinx. So Ivan Van Sertima is a professor and highly respected, but he's being criticized because Ivan Van Sertima is actually uncovering the lie and the whitewash of history, and he's revealing the truth. And obviously people are criticizing him for this because they don't want him uncovering the lie that they covered up 200-300 years before, but he's uncovering it. And he's showing evidence, and he's a scholar. So you can't argue with him when he shows you proof. And that's the thing. So anyway, so a man who used to be in the British Museum said that he saw the nose of the Sphinx in the British Museum. And Ivan Van Sertima said to this man, look, I am a scholar. You can't tell me a story. You have to show me the evidence. You can't tell me stories. I believe you, but I can't go on your word. Show me evidence. So the man gets a job in the British Museum, right? He gets a job. He's a white guy. He gets a job in the British Museum. And while he's in the British Museum, he takes a picture of the nose of the Sphinx in the British Museum. He gives that picture to Ivan van Sertima. With that picture in his hands, Ivan van Sertima now has the proof that the nose of the Sphinx was Negroid in shape, right? So Ivan van Sertima gets on the phone and has a four-way conference call with the head of antiquity in the British Museum. Who was on that phone call? Ivan van Sertima was on the phone call. Sheikh Anta Diop, who was the Senegalese scholar, he was on that phone call. The head of antiquity for Egypt was on that phone call, and the head of the British Museum was on the phone call. And Ivan van Sertima tells the story that the man the head of antiquity said, look, Ivan, if everybody came here and claimed all the stuff back from the British Museum, the museum would be empty. We can't do that. Ivan van Sertima said, we're not asking you to empty the British Museum. We're asking you to give the nose back to the Sphinx, because it's in the basement of the museum. No one's seeing it. It's not on display. Why? You don't need it there. Bring it back to Egypt. And Sheikh Anta Diop went on to espouse that the origins of the original peoples of Egypt were actually Negro in phenotype, and he went on to explain a whole bunch of things, how the culture of the West Africans is identical to the culture of the ancient Egyptians. They're the same people, same culture. And he says that he himself, Sheikh Anta Diop himself, is a part of that royal family who came from Egypt originally. Okay, then the head of antiquity said to the head of the Egyptian antiquity, okay, fine. These two men, one in England, one in Africa, one at West Africa, are claiming that the nose should be brought back to Egypt. What do you say, Mr. Head of Antiquity in Egypt? What do you say? And he said, we don't want that nose coming back to Egypt, because if you put a nigger nose on the Sphinx, it will frighten away the tourists. We don't want it.
That is racism.
Well, that was racism, but also the people of Egypt today, they don't want the facts that the ancient Egyptians were black people who look like Nigerians, who look like Sudanese. They don't want that, because they then have to say that they're not the real Egyptians.
Well, I've been to Egypt and I've been to Cairo, and I know you have. And I remember every time I would see a sculpting of what I would know as an African person, most of the time the nose would be
cut off.
It would be not there. There would be no nose. It'd been shot off, and they would give some explanation that, oh, during battle and war this thing fell.
He fell on his nose. Everyone fell on his nose, you know.
Everyone fell on their nose. This is what the guide would tell us. And I was like, nah, this doesn't sound right, you know. But anytime there was a sculpting or a carving of a European, or what they considered to be a European person,
a
European look, the nose would be in perfect condition.
Correct. So what happened was that those early scholars, though not scholars, but those early archaeologists, they decided to retell history. And they basically said, all the statues with Negro-looking wide noses, we are going to destroy the evidence. So we're going to say only the skinny nose pharaohs should be there. So let's go and give you some context now for the pharaohs themselves and Egypt itself. So what you've got, and remember, I grew up as a Christian. So when I went to Egypt, I was very confused at some points. But so let me give some context for myself and my understanding. When I was young, I grew up as a Christian, and I'm reading a book called the Bible, right? And in this Bible, I'm told that the pharaohs beat up Moses and he was horrible to the Israelites. So as far as I'm concerned, I was brought up to believe that Pharaoh was the bad guy. Pharaoh is the bad guy for beating up God's people, the Israelites. So because of that, Pharaoh is the bad guy, Israelites are the good guys. And as far as I'm concerned, I hate all the pharaohs. They're all the bad guys. I then go to Egypt. And when I go to Egypt, I get exposed to a place called the Karnak Temple. The Karnak Temple was where the secret society of the priesthood and the wisdom keepers was actually located. This was the university city. It was a university city, right? And this was where everybody who was anybody was getting educated. So if you want to come away with 25 PhDs, this is where you went in ancient times. You went to Karnak Temple. You could only go there if you were even selected. You couldn't just turn up. You had to be initiated. It was a secret society, okay? When I go to this place, I had the most ridiculously weird experience. I'm actually walking in to places where only the most high, either you are royalty or you're the most high priesthood. I went into inner sanctum where they would call it the Holy of Holies. Only the kings could go there. Only the high royalty, high priesthood could go there. No one else. And I'm in this location and I just get this deja vu feeling. I've been here before. It was the weirdest experience. And I'm thinking, this doesn't, remember, at this stage, I know nothing about Egyptian history, nothing other than the Bible. Nothing, I don't know anything. And I'm thinking, I get this weird feeling, I've been here before. My spirit was telling me, this is weird. And so I'm in there and I'm thinking, I don't get it. I don't understand how I have this connection to Egypt, yet my family come from Jamaica. I have no business being comfortable with Egypt because my family came from Jamaica. So, and that happened to me when I was 21. I went to Jamaica and I went to the places where my family came from in Jamaica, and I felt at home. For the first time in my life, I was in a place where I actually felt at home because everybody said I was their people. Do you understand? My family in Jamaica owned me. They claimed me and said, welcome back, my brother, welcome back. So I felt at home. So I understood why my spirit felt good in Jamaica. I get it. I'm now in Egypt, a place I have no connection with outside of Bible stories. And I feel like I was connected to that location. I was connected to it. Then you might say, hang on, but Miles, you just said it's in the Bible. That's why you know about it. My whole being, my spirit was moving me in a way that was so powerful. And it was way more powerful than Jamaica, way more powerful. And I made myself a promise. I said, I'm going to come back here. But when I come back, I'm going to come back understanding what I'm looking at. I'm going to read up on Egyptian history. I'm going to read up on everything. And I'm going to understand it all first. So when I go back, my eyes are opened and I can see what I'm seeing. I want to be able to see what's going on here. Because my spirit was just moving me in a way that was so weird. It was like, in fact, I would even say that, in fact, I said at the time, my brain got rewired. When I walked into Egypt, I was one person. And when I left Egypt, I was there for 2 weeks. And when I left Egypt, I was somebody different. I was a different person. I got rewired just by being there.
Yeah. I felt a similar feeling when I was at a place called Mount Sinai, and I got this kind of feeling like similar to yourself, like as if I'd been there, but also that there was this feeling of, I can't even explain it, but it was like there was a spirit there. It was very, very strong feeling of the ancestors calling me almost, and telling me, this is your home, you should be here. And I felt really good there. I really did. But also another thing, this name that we call the Sphinx, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the original name, or what is the proper name? I understand it's Harem Arket. What do you understand it to be called?
That is a name I've also heard as well. So, okay, so let's go back. And I want to give everything in context again. All right. So the pyramids are in Egypt. Yes.
Yeah.
When were they built? They were built around the third and the fourth dynasties. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And there was a fella called Imhotep who was associated with the design of the very first one. He didn't build the Great Pyramid because he died by then, but he gave the blueprint to get it done. Imhotep was a multi-genius, and he was a black person. He was a black man, as what we would call today. But the word black man is actually a word that actually disinherits you from your inheritance. So we should never, ever call ourselves black people ever again, ever. We are not black people. What we are from various tribes within certain parts of the world. The only thing is that we just don't know what those names are anymore because we got disconnected from our own inheritance. And so because of that, we got labeled Negro, black, colored, and whatever. And that was their way of taking us away from our own historical history. All right. Going back to the third dynasty. The third dynasty built the pyramids. Then you've got the 14th dynasty. Egypt is invaded by outsiders who come from the Iraq area, Lebanon area, that part of the world, and they are known in the writings of the Egyptians. They're known as the Hyksos. These are the shepherd kings, right? Around that time, they invade for 400 years. They take over Egypt, and they persecute the Egyptians, these outsiders. Okay, the 18th dynasty wages war against them and kicks them out, and they leave. 18th dynasty. So you've got from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th dynasties, invaders are controlling Egypt. 18th dynasty, they're kicked out, and Egypt goes back into a massive sort of resurgence of confidence and growth, etc. Okay. So the first time in recorded history, Egypt is invaded by foreigners in the 14th to the 18th dynasty. 18th dynasty kicks them out. And the first one was a guy called, I think it was Ahmose. And so Moses, that we have been speaking about in this book, Moses is the name, a very, very popular pharaoh name in the 18th dynasty. You've got Ahmose, you've got another Moses, and you've got three Tutmoses. Tutmose the first, Tutmoses the second, Tutmoses the third. The most famous of those is really Tutmoses the third. He was considered to be Napoleon of the time. And he would wage war against his neighbors. And he took them over and made them part of his empire. So Egypt wasn't just one location. Egypt had an empire. And Tutmosis III was one of the characters who did that. The one who was in power before him was Tutmosis, or his dad was Tutmosis II. And when Tutmosis II died, Tutmosis II's daughter, Hatshepsut, took over the throne as regent. But instead of her holding the throne for Tutmosis III, she made herself the king. And so she became the king of England, the king of Egypt, a woman. And in all the statues, she's given herself a beard, right? All right. But she was a very, very famous person in her time. And she was very instrumental in actually having Egypt make lots of diplomatic ties. She wasn't a warlike leader. She was a peacemaking leader. But
this is Hatshepsut.
This is Hatshepsut. Yes. So she is between Tutmosis II and Tutmosis III. That's when she reigns. Okay. And then after Tutmosis III, then you go to a number of others. Now there was a king called Amenhotep. I think Amenhotep. Amenhotep III is a king who brings up his son to have a different idea about things. But Amenhotep III couldn't change things. 18th dynasty still. So his son, Amenhotep IV, comes to power. And he renames himself Akhenaten.
All right.
Akhenaten was born Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV. Amen is the head. And he says, forget this God called Amen. We are now, remember, Amen is a God. Amen's a god. And they name themselves after the gods, so after the deities or after whatever they want to be associated with. Amenhotep IV renames himself Akhenaten and changes the religion of Egypt. He persecutes the Amen priesthood and they won't listen to him. So he literally he makes a new city, moves it away from Karnak, the place where all the elite is and all the priests is, and he builds a brand new city in a place called Amarna.
And
That's his
when are we talking about timeline?
1300 BC.
All right.
1300 BC. And that's the 18th dynasty, near to the end. Now, because of the upheaval that is created by his religious revolution, there was a lot of resentment in the country for him. A lot of resentment, especially in Karnak, the seat of the original priesthood. And so when his son, or one of his sons, is born, he named his son Tut-Ankh-Aten, because Aten is the god that he wants everyone to worship, the sun. And Aten means the rays of the sun, the rays of the sun. All right. And he says there is only one God, the rays of the sun. And the way to the God is through me. I am the way to the sun. So if you want to get to God, you come through me. Do you know who said those same words? Jesus. Jesus said, if you want to, I and my Father are one. If you want to go to the Father, you have to come through me. All right. The words of Jesus are really the words of Akhenaten. In other words, the Akhenaten story has been represented to us in another format, and we're basically worshipping the Akhenaten religion today. We're worshipping it today. All right. So anyways, let's continue. He creates a brand new religion. And when he dies, or he's killed, or whatever happens, and his wife is Nefertiti, by the way. Nefertiti is his wife. And when he dies, his son comes to the throne, but his son is young and he's too small. So he has a regent in charge, and that regent is called Ai. He's like a vizier or prime minister. And when the boy comes of age, and while he was little, he had to rechange his name. So he had to change his name from Tut-Ankh-Aten to Tut-Ankh-Amen, because Amen is a god that they worship and they value in the southern part of Egypt. So Tut-Ankh-Amen is the new name for this boy, whose father was Akhenaten. All right. When he dies childless, right? So Ai takes over, and Ai doesn't have any kids. Horemheb takes over, and no children. And so the general, the guy in charge of the army, Ramesses, takes over. Ramesses has a child called Seti I. So they now become the members of the 19th dynasty. 19th dynasty. They start the new dynasty. Ramesses I has a child called Seti I. Seti I has a child called Ramesses II. And Ramesses II is Ramesses the Great. This is Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II. 19th dynasty. We're now in 1200 BC. 1200 BC. This is a military family. This is a military pharaoh royal priesthood. So even they're not related to the 18th dynasty by blood, but because they're military, these guys can't come back. They can't come back because these guys are military and they're too powerful. So what happened to that bloodline? Because remember, Akhenaten had about 4 daughters. Yeah, he creates a brand new religion. He creates a brand new everything. So what happens to his priesthood, who believe in the old one? Well, they get either killed, they have to convert back into Armanism, or they have to leave. Yeah, and so you have a whole bunch of priests, you have a whole bunch of people related to Akhenaten, his daughters. He had 4 daughters. You have these women who are part of the 18th dynasty bloodline. You have the priesthood. You have an administration who knows how to run a country, and they leave. And here's a story now of how Black people got to Scotland. This 18th dynasty pharaoh and his entourage people and the bloodline, the royal bloodline now, they leave and go to Egypt and go to what we call Israel today. From Israel, they go to Spain. Yes? From Spain, they found Spain a bit too hostile. I know you like Spain, but they found Spain a bit too hostile, and they left Spain and they went to Ireland. From Ireland, they went to Scotland, and from Scotland, they became the royal family of Scotland. And that is why the Scottish bloodline and the priest and the royal family were black, because they originally came from Egypt.
So the timeline for that now, when they went from Egypt to Spain
To Ireland,
and
to
then to
Scotland.
Scotland.
Yes.
How long did that take? That
I don't know how long the journey was, but I do know that Ramesses the Great was on the throne in the 1200s. Akhenaten was on the throne in the 1300s.
It's BC, you're talking.
BC. So the royal family of Scotland had to go and relocate themselves during the time of the 19th dynasty. And they left and went to Scotland in the 19th dynasty, during the time of the 19th dynasty, and they relocated themselves and they went to Scotland.
But the royal family of that Scotland, of Scotland then, is not connected to the royal family of England, is it, in any way?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Because King James, here's another problem. And the problem is we are mixing up reality with mythology. Yeah? Because remember I told you, the people of the 18th dynasty had a new religion.
Mm-hmm.
And that new religion was what they carried with them. Because that religion was not accepted in Egypt, because they got rid of them. They said, no. So let me give you some context. The religion of Egypt before Akhenaten and after Akhenaten is very similar to Hinduism. Yeah, Hinduism has many gods, many deities, God for this, God for that, God for whatever. The Egyptian religion was like that. Different names, but it was like that. So Hinduism is the close equivalent on earth today of the ancient Egyptian religion. You turn your camera. Yeah? So that's the close equivalent. Akhenaten comes along and says, no, there's only one God. There's only one God. And that one God religion and the whole concept stuck in the minds of people. And that was exported to Europe. That was exported to the Middle East. So the people who ran with this one God story were what we call the Jewish people today. Yeah? So the Jewish people are the inheritors of Akhenaten's religious revolution. The Hebrew Israelites are the inheritors of the one God religion. The Christians are the inheritors of the one God religion. The Muslims are the inheritors of this one God religion. All those three religions are coming really from a root of Akhenaten, who done it in the 18th dynasty, in 1300 BC.
And I can imagine that there must be many great secrets that have been hidden from public view, that were literally, I think, written for us by our ancestors, that we are supposed to have access to, but they've ended up in the hands of other people.
For example?
Well, they're secrets. I don't know. I don't know what they are. I hear that they're secrets that were written, and
Okay.
possibly you even being in the presence when you said that you went to that place in Egypt and you were in the presence of a place where our ancestors had been. I know from certain research I've done that they left certain either books, papyruses of wisdom, certain things that they were buried with. For example, even the Ankh symbol is a very powerful symbol. And then now you're telling me that this name Ankh was in the name that they would have. So
of course,
there's
Ankh, Amen.
Exactly. So this is not just a symbol that's pretty that some people think, wow, that's a nice symbol. There's something very powerful attached to it, in terms of possibly it could be used for healing. I know some people would use a divining rod, for diagnosing. like this. There's a lot of powerful stuff that we don't know about Egypt and Africa and our people that's been hidden from us that other people have now captured and are
Okay.
using possibly for their own benefit and not our benefit.
So if I was to put a full stop, not a full stop, a dot on your I and a cross on your T to back up what you're saying, what happened was that, remember I told you the 18th dynasty was replaced by the 19th, right? And that was around 1200 BC. And for the next many hundreds of years, Egypt was run by black people who look like me and you. Okay. Now, around 500 BC, Egypt was invaded by a Persian army. This Persian army literally ended the pharaonic kingship in Egypt. It ended it. Okay. It continued in Sudan. Sudan maintained the pharaonic lineage because this book talks about a king called King Taharqa, who went to save the Israelites from the Persian atrocities. This book talks about part of the history of that. King Taharqa, all right? And then in fact, let me just quickly step away from that. There is a film called Black Panther. Black Panther was actually showed a city called Wakanda. Wakanda was located between Sudan and Uganda in the film. Yeah. This was the seat of the last dynasty of Egypt, of Northern Egypt, the last dynasty, which is known as the 25th dynasty. And Taharqa was one of those kings. And if you look at the film, the two Black Panther kings was T'Challa and T'Chaka. T'Challa, T'Chaka. And they were basically telling you Taharqa is who they're mimicking and basing it on. The 25th dynasty. And the 25th dynasty pharaohs were African origin. African. They looked darker than me and you. In fact, me and you look like white people compared to Taharqa.
Let me ask you another question now. Let's go to.
Let me finish a point and I'll let you continue. So Taharqa was the last in the northern Egypt when the Persians took over in 500 BC. The Persians beat up the Greeks and a whole bunch of people. And 200 years later, 300 BC, the Greeks took revenge on the atrocities the Persians had meted on them. And Alexander the Great went into Persia and destroyed that empire. Yeah? 300 BC, he takes over the Persian Empire, and because the Persians had taken over Egypt 200 years before, he finds himself as the boss of Egypt now. He gets himself coronated as a god king in Egypt, and then he goes off to India to continue to take over the Persian Empire because he doesn't want them to regroup and come back. So he wants to kill off that empire completely, right? So he goes off and waging into India. While he's there, he says to his general, Ptolemy, he says to him, Ptolemy, I want you to look after Egypt while I'm gone. Just look after it. He's a general and he's a military man. And so he says, no problem. Off goes Alexander to wage war. Alexander's finished fighting and he comes back. On the way back, he gets killed. Alexander gets killed. And so Alexander didn't get a chance to consolidate his new empire, right? And so the empire breaks up into little fragments. And Ptolemy ends up being in charge of Egypt. So he said, okay, I haven't got a boss. I'm the boss. So he goes to the priesthood in Egypt and says to them, make me God. Make me the God king. Which was a tradition at the time. And they said, we can't make you God because you're not part of the bloodline associated with the original pharaohs. You're not that. You're an outsider. You're a Greek. You're not an African. You're not African. You're not one of us. Right? This is now 300 BC. And he says, okay, no problem. He takes away all their books, manuscripts, and papyrus manuscripts, he closes down the temple and he throws them on the street. He goes to the next temple, make me God. They say, no, we can't, because you're not part of the bloodline. We can't do it. You're not an Egyptian. So he closes their temple, takes away all their books and throws them on the street. He keeps on doing this until the Melkite Coptic Egyptians realize what's going to happen to them if they don't say yes to him. So he goes up to the Melkite Coptic priesthood, and they says, yes, okay, no problem. Here's what we're going to do. We'll make you God. And they take two of their own gods, the Apis bull and Osiris. Osiris, the god of resurrection, the savior god, effectively. No, Horus is the savior god. The god of resurrection, Osiris, and he was known as Osar. Osiris is the Greek word for him. Osar is the Kemetic word for him. So Egypt was called Kemet. The Kemet word for him was Osar. A-U-S-A-R is how we spell it today. In their time, they spelt it O-S-I-R, Osir. Osir. All right. So they create a new religion. They bring these two deities, these two ideas together, and it's called Osir Apis, Serapis. At some point, they chopped off the O, and it was known as Serapis. Yeah? Serapis became this new religion they created to tame the Greeks, because the Greeks were barbarians in this time. 300 BC, they were barbarians, the Greeks. They had a powerful army, but they had no culture. That was high society culture. They didn't have it. So what happens? All the books was given to this priesthood, and they're all just piled up somewhere. Two Ptolemies later, I think it's Philadelphus. Two Ptolemies later, Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. They take all these books and they build a library in Alexandria. The Alexandrian Library now has the collected history of Egypt, going back thousands of years. And they put it all into a library in Alexandria. And to explain where this knowledge came from, the Greeks said these books came from Homer. Homer wrote everything.
But that wasn't true.
No, it wasn't true. But they had to explain where the books come from. They didn't want to say that we stole it from the Egyptians, because now they're in control of Egypt. Yeah? And they're known as the Ptolemaic dynasty. So these Greeks are now in control of Egypt with all of Egypt's wisdom. They build this library, and now this library becomes a mecca of understanding and knowledge. All the knowledge of Egypt is now going to other people now.
There's no way Homer could have written all of those manuscripts.
It was impossible. Homer would have to be 10,000 years old to have actually written everything, because the wisdom was literally all of the wisdom of Egypt going back to antiquity.
That was the secret that I was trying to tell you, that were hidden from us, because that library was burnt down. So we don't have access to a lot of that. Or
Correct.
some of the books still exist
in the Vatican. Some material still exists, but here's the point.
Not just in the Vatican. There's also books that were written by Imhotep that are in the Karl Marx University in Leipzig, Germany. 20 volumes.
There we go. And because Imhotep was a genius and wrote so many stuff, he would have been a treasure trove by himself, and he was one man, and he wasn't the only one. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of geniuses who had literally PhDs, 25 PhDs. You know, do you know what I mean? They were so clever, and this was the seat of the genuine geniuses of Africa. They were there. Anyway, so the Greeks are now in charge of Egypt's wisdom. And the first generations can't read hieroglyphs. They can't read any of it. So they're all barbarians. And these are Greeks who are barbarians, right? So what happens then is that as they stay there longer and longer, they start, the generations afterwards start to go to school, the wisdom school in Alexandria. They go to school and they start to get clever. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, the Greeks are now given the credit for the wisdom that the Egyptians had written thousands of years prior to them. The Greeks take credit for that. The very last royal family of the time of the Ptolemies was a lady called Cleopatra the Seventh. Cleopatra the Seventh was the first Ptolemy who was able to read hieroglyphics. She was the first.
Mm.
So all the ones before her couldn't read hieroglyphics. They were just sitting on the throne, taking up all the benefits of the country, but they were not the scholars.
Mm.
Cleopatra the Seventh was a scholar. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Cleopatra the Seventh. She has an encounter with a fellow called Julius Caesar. She has a child with him called Caesarion. Yeah? And she planned to create a new empire with Rome included. Rome wasn't having it. So they came in and took over the whole thing. So now Greek lost influence in Rome with the invasion of Rome of Egypt. And Rome made Egypt basically one of their satellite countries, one of their provinces. And so you've now got Egypt now being controlled by the Romans. And this would have happened about maybe 50 BC, 40 BC, 40 BC. So you've now got the Persians were in charge for 200 years. The Greeks were in charge for 300 years. Yeah. And now the Romans are in charge. Yeah. And the Romans literally, created an empire of all of North Africa, parts of what we call Arabia, that area, into Turkey, and they have Europe. Yeah, and they go as far as Germany on one side and Britain, they take over Britain. And that's basically the Roman Empire. And that Roman Empire goes from about, like I said, about what, 60 BC, around that time, up until, when they were destroyed by the Germanic invasion, 500 AD. So they last about 500 years.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. About the pyramids, there is this belief that they didn't build the pyramids.
Hold that thought 1 second. I'm going to pause. Your question was about the pyramids.
About the pyramids, how were they built and who built them? This is the question I want to ask.
Okay, I wasn't there, and neither were you. So what do we know? We know that the pyramids was in place around the third dynasty. Yeah?
Yeah.
The only people in Egypt at that time were Black Africans. I already told you that there was a Hyksos invasion around the 14th dynasty. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So 14th dynasty is roughly about 2000 BC, roughly. The third dynasty is roughly about 4000 BC, 3000, 4000 BC, roughly that. Yeah. So before the invaders came in, who would have come from the land of Iraq and land of Lebanon, that area, before they came in, the pyramids are already there.
Right. Okay. And there were apparently great doctors and wise men, apart from Imhotep, who we know well about. But what about the doctors that were before him and wise men before him? Could you name them?
No, I couldn't. But I do know that Imhotep's mother was also a doctor.
Yeah.
And she was a very, very smart lady. It's Imhotep's mum. So, but you must remember this. There's a place called the Karnak Temple. The Karnak Temple was a society of very, very clever people. And they were literally spewing out, as a university city, and they were spewing out the equivalent of men with PhDs by the thousands every year. And these men, the very best of these men, would take positions in the government, would take positions in the country, in the administration. And the ones who couldn't get positions, they went to other parts of the world. Some went to Europe, and they became the wise men of Europe. Some went to India and started to help the civilizations of India. Some went to Cambodia, some went to Vietnam, some went to Africa, other parts of Africa. Some went to America. Yeah. So they were actually spewing out their great academics, and they were going all over the world.
Hmm.
Some
All
went to
right.
China, some went to Japan. They were going everywhere.
We spoke once about how long a person would study for when
Yes.
they were like a student in Egypt. And when you compare it to a student, let's say in England, that person appears to have way more knowledge and would have studied for a lot longer. How long would a typical student in Egypt study for?
Okay. If you were fortunate to be either have the father of a priesthood, and they were known as priests, by the way. Today we'd call them professors. Um, they would start educating age 7 years old. You'd go to school. You would finish your education when you was 40 years old. 40. So you were in school between 7 and 40. By the time you got to age 40, you had basically what they will say you had 360 degrees of knowledge. So you would have studied all the curriculum, and you would have walked away with the equivalent of maybe 20 PhDs. And with that understanding, you go into the world, and then you would start to become someone useful in society, because you're a member of society then. And you're part of the secret society, because you're one of those educated ones who were then making sure that things happened in a way that was run well.
So even if you were, so even people who studied for 20 years, they're still a school leaver by Egyptian standards.
And well, if you study for 20 years, you're at age 27. So you might have gotten your first degree, but that's it.
Wow.
You
And
wouldn't
what
have
do you know
gotten
about
your.
do you know about the so-called mystery system?
Well, I'm describing the basis of the mystery system. The mystery system is literally the schools where they will teach you, geometry. They will teach you astronomy. They will teach you medicine. They will teach you architecture. They will teach you, all the sciences that they thought was appropriate. They will teach you, the religion. And in fact, the religion itself codified their secrets.
Mm.
The religion effectively was children's stories hiding the secrets codified in those ways. In other words, they had this deep wisdom, and to make it easy for someone who was young to understand it, they told it to you in story form.
Mm. Right. Okay.
And as you became older, they would unravel that story, they'll unravel it, and then make you know the actual basis of that. So they were even studying things like the atom and the basis of reality. So
Mm.
today we're talking about things like, you know, understand. I mean, literally, they were going through that. And I'll give one step further. Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, was credited with coming up with something called calculus, and he said that he was trying to figure out how gravity works, and an apple fell on his head, and that was the story. Well, the reality is that Sir Isaac Newton was part of a secret society.
Mm.
And that secret society had knowledge of the ancient wisdom of Egypt. And he was studying some of those mathematical papyruses. And that's how he came with calculus. Calculus was something that was recovered, and because he understood it from the ancient writings from back in the day. And he was given the credit of discovering it, but it was something that they knew back in the day. Here's another one, the Pythagoras theorem. This is the mathematical formula for describing a triangle. Well, guess what the pyramid is made in the shape of?
Yeah.
A triangle. So Pythagoras, who was walking on the earth 500 BC, could not have been the originator of Pythagoras' theorem. Why? Because the pyramid was built 4000 BC or 3000 BC, between there. So the pyramids were built minimum 3000 years before he was born.
And also, I've actually seen the papyrus, what they call the Rhine papyrus, which Alexander Rhind from Scotland is given the credit for discovering. But obviously, he himself could not have been the originator of that wisdom in the Rhine papyrus.
No. And that's the thing about, okay, one of the reasons why the Europeans are so, why they're so in love with the Egyptian wisdoms is because the basis of European civilization came from the Egyptians who left Egypt and went to Europe and brought a civilization there, and the basis of running countries. It was the Egyptians who had educated them. That is why they're connected. Europeans are actually related to the Egyptians, which is really weird. Remember I told you the Scottish nobility came from Egypt originally, 18th dynasty Egypt. Remember I said that?
Yeah.
They're connected, but not just the Scottish. The Irish are connected. Some of the Germans are connected. The Germans. And then many thousands of years later, you then get another, but they're having an outpouring of Africans leaving Africa and going around the world educating people. Yeah, Africans. So they even went to America. And apparently, I mean, even though Ivan Van Sertima says they came before Columbus, and he was describing the Olmec heads that was found in Mexico, that's evidence right there. So let me share this with you. And that was found in a place called La Venta. Let me share this with you. I went on a holiday to America, and I decided to go to Mexico. And I had done something called the Mayan Trail. And the Mayan Trail looked at the Mayan civilization in Mexico. And it also goes into Guatemala. Now, because of the sort of, there was like a civil war going on in Guatemala at the time. So I couldn't go, as a tourist, we couldn't just go from Mexico into Guatemala. Our border was shut. But the whole Mayan civilization goes from literally all of Central America. It just moves all the way into there. Anyway, the Mayans. The Mayans were the ones who were credited with building the pyramids. What do the Mayans look like? The Mayans look like me and you, Patrick. The Mayans were us. The Mayans are Moors. That's who the Mayans are. Let's keep going. Go before the Mayans are the Olmecs. The Olmecs look like Africans from Nigeria. Yes? The Mayans and the Olmecs. These would have been called Moors too. And these Olmecs and Mayans, well, maybe not the Mayans, because the Mayans actually Mayans were born in America, but the Olmecs came to America with this deep wisdom, which came from Egypt. So the Egyptian wisdom literally came to America, and they built pyramids based on that deep wisdom and understanding. So let me just share this with you. A lot of scholars try to explain away how it was possible to have a culture in Mexico practically identical to culture in Egypt. Yeah. I'm going to share this with you. The reasons why they are similar is because they were the same people. So to demonstrate my point, I'm going to say it this way. The Greeks were living in Egypt and did not build pyramids anywhere. The Romans took over Egypt, went all over the pyramids and built pyramids nowhere. It wasn't part of their cultural, it wasn't part of their religion, their culture. It didn't mean nothing to them. Yeah. There's parts of London I grew up in. There are Hindu temples everywhere. Hindu temples. Who built them? The people who built the Hindu temples are the Hindus. Hindus left India, yeah, Hindustan, India, and they came to England and built Hindu temples. The English did not build those Hindu temples in England. The Hindus did it. The same thing with the Muslims. The Muslims left, say, Arabia, left Pakistan, and they came to England and they built mosques for their religious purposes. Yes. So the reasons why the Greeks, who had now stolen all the wisdom of Egypt, they didn't build pyramids because it wasn't relevant to their cultural identity and whatever, but it was relevant to the Mexicans or the Olmecs in Mexico, because they were the same Egyptians. They were the same people. Who exactly were these people, and when did they turn up? The very first story I'm familiar with is when Ramesses III, the 19th dynasty, when he and his had a visit to America. He went to Louisiana in America, and he left a whole bunch of artifacts. But more importantly, there was a whole bunch of his people who built a civilization in America. Now, some people would argue that the American civilization came before the Egyptian civilization, and what it wasn't that Egypt went to Africa, to America. It was that the Americans, the Black Americans, went to Egypt and brought the technology. I don't know which is true. All I do know is that they're both people in the same location.
Right.
What I would say to you as well, when the Persian invasion took place of Egypt, all those Black people either got captured and enslaved, they got murdered, or they ran away. One bunch of those priesthood who ran away, they ran west, and they became the Dogon in West Africa today. Another bunch went south into India, and they went to Cambodia and built a temple complex in Cambodia today. Those Black people, or we call them Black, but those Egyptian Kemetic peoples with brown faces went to Cambodia and built temples, and their sacred god was called Sambo. Sambo was God, and Sambo had a broad nose and thick lips. Sambo.
And that's the same name that they would use to take the mickey out of Black people way back in the 70s, I remember.
That's correct.
But you're actually being called a king.
You're being called God, one step higher. But because we were ignorant, we thought they were insulting us. But they were insulting us, but they were insulting us with a word we didn't understand. Had we fully understood that Sambo was God in Cambodia, Sambo was God in Vietnam, if we knew that, we would have said, thank you for calling me God, I accept.
And that, funny enough, that word doesn't get used so much anymore to put down.
No, because what happened, a lot of the during the Vietnam War, a lot of Americans, Black Americans, white Americans went to fight in the Vietnam War. And while they was there, the Vietnamese people were treating the Black American soldiers like gods. But in the context of the American society, the Black people were the underclass, yeah? And this is what caused confusion for the Vietnamese people, because they thought that the Black people were the bosses of America, because they used to be. They used to be. Before Christopher Columbus and the Europeans started in America, the Black Americans were the boss of America. And they know that because those same people went to Cambodia and built their city complex in Cambodia.
Yeah. And you know, I hear that there was in the Roman times, you had Black Roman emperors, I believe, or Black kings. Could you touch on that?
Yes, they were Caesars. They were called Caesars. The most famous one, the most famous Black one, was a guy called Septimus Severus. Yeah. And he came to England and basically tried to just kind of civilize the Britons. And remember now, the Britons at this stage were a combination of tribes. Some of them look like me and you, Patrick. Some of the British tribes look like me and you. All right. These tribes, they tried to basically civilize them. Or not civilize them, they occupy and take over their land. So why did they even care about that? But when England had some resources that they wanted to basically get access to, this is the Romans now. And so the Romans, Caesar called Septimus Severus, came here with an African army. He came to Britain with an African army, and he stationed his Black soldiers all over the place.
What time are we talking about? What year?
So Septimus Severus would have been about maybe, I should look this up, but roughly about 200, 300 AD is the time of Septimus Severus. Yeah. Okay, so he comes to Britain, and he is the Caesar, and he's in charge, but he's living in Britain, right, with his army, and they basically, come here. He dies, and he was buried in a place called York, in the north of England. He's buried there.
He's still there now?
Yes, his body's still there now. His son Caracalla took over, and his son was very Negroid in appearance, very Negroid, even more so than his dad. His dad kind of had like a mixture look. Caracalla, his mum must have been African because he was very Negroid in appearance. Caracalla, for some reason, doesn't do well, and his bodyguards end up murdering him. So he ended up basically being Caesar for maybe 10 years, that kind of time frame. And so he gets murdered, and then they go back into, choosing some other person. But what we do know within this context of Britain, we had a black Caesar called Septimus Severus who died, and he was very clever, but his son just wasn't his dad's caliber. And Caracalla basically took over for a time, but he didn't have the gravitas to run an empire, so they got rid of him.
Okay, you're talking about 200 AD to 300 AD.
That's correct, yeah.
Is there a connection between those guys and the royal family that we know of today?
No, not that, not those, because the Romans took over England during the time of Claudius. So Claudius, Emperor Claudius. So give a timeline. We go from Julius Caesar, we then go to Augustus Caesar, we then go to Caligula, and then we go to Claudius. So the fourth Caesar in that line. And Claudius comes to England and he takes over England. He invades, he brings a Roman army into England. In 500 AD, and this was about maybe, it must have been about maybe literally the beginning of about 2,000 years ago, Claudius. I don't think Claudius was BC, I think Claudius is AD. Claudius is AD. But right at the beginning of AD, like 10 AD, 20 AD, that kind of thing. That's Claudius. Then you've got, and they stay here for about 400 years. So why do the Romans leave? The Romans leave to protect the empire being destroyed by the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals, 500 AD. Remember I told you that 500 AD? So around that time, 500 AD, Romans, Italy is being destroyed, and so the Roman soldiers in Britain leave to go and help. All right, but by the time they get here, it's too late. The whole thing is destroyed. The Roman Empire, it collapses in the West, completely collapses. And then you have 3 Germanic tribes. They come to Britain because Britain is undefended. These 3 tribes are the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. So Saxons come from Saxony. The Jutes come from somewhere in Germany, what we call Germany today, and the Angles come from somewhere in Germany today. These 3 tribes come into Britain. And then the land, part of the land of Britain, gets renamed Engelsland, the land of the Engels. So the German people rename Britain England.
All right.
Engelsland.
Right, okay.
So here's what's interesting. If you have a brown face and you're born in Wales, you're Welsh. Because the ancient Welsh were brown-faced people. If you have a brown face and you're born in Scotland, you're Scottish, because the brown-faced people were in Scotland from the beginning of time. If you are a brown-faced person and you're born in Ireland, you're Irish, because the brown-faced Irish have been there from the beginning of time. If you are a brown-faced person born in England, you are not English, you're British. And the question is why? Why that distinction? And the distinction is made because the English are the foreigners who invaded Britain. Because when they invaded Britain, brown-faced people were living in Britain all along. So we look more like the indigenous Britons, not the invaders who were the English, who came from Germany.
Wow, interesting.
And that's why they don't call black people English in England, because we are not part of the invaders, we're part of the indigenous. And the indigenous were the original Britons. And that's why they call black people British, not English in England.
Right. Okay, well.
Now, let me go one step further. This invasion took place 449 AD. And this was a lecture that was given in Manchester University by a professor whose name I don't remember, in 1849, I believe, around that time, 1840s. And he said, this is the history of England. White people came to Britain for the first time during the invasion of the Germans coming over in 449 AD. Before that, Britain was a mixed race multicultural, multiracial organization. White people came in around 449 AD and started to miscegenate, interbreed with the locals, local brown-faced people. They started to kill them off, and they chased them out. And they chased them west to Ireland, west to Wales, west to Scotland, north to Scotland, and west to Cornwall. This is where the brown-faced people were. There are parts of the Middle England called the Moors, the marshland, where the brown-faced people went to live, to get away from the invading white Germanic tribes or Teutonic tribes. These are the brown-faced Moors, and there's parts of England called the Moors. That's where.
Yeah. So this is where the Moors would have been as well.
That's where they were pushed into to get away from this invading force from Germany.
Right. Okay. And what about the Moors of Spain? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I can. During the time of the invasions of the Germans into Italy, they also invaded Spain. And there was a king called King Roderick. A lot of complaints are going out about King Roderick, that he was literally just stealing people's lands, raping people, murdering people, and the big complaints going out. And so some of the nobility of Spain asked the Moors in North Africa to help them. And they said, yes, we will help you. And they came in with an army under Tariq. Now, the Moorish army had two sources. The Muslim army had two sources. Some were Arabic looking and some were African looking. African, like me and you. And some were Arabic looking. This combination of Muslims came in to Spain to save Spain from the incursions and the atrocities of those barbarians coming in from Germany. They wage war against King Roderick and get rid of him. King Roderick is gone. Once they do that, they literally decide to rebuild the Spanish civilization, rebuild it, because the Germans destroyed it. They were not a civilizing force. So you could even argue the Moors who came in from North Africa, they raised Spain up. Raised. They raised Spain up from being this mashed up society to high civilization. The Germans who came in, they raised Europe down. Razed. They raised it down, and the white Germans raised Europe to the ground, and the black Moors, they raised Europe back up to decent civilization. They did this between the years 711 and 1492. So for over 700 years, they ruled Spain. And when they ruled Spain, they made Spain the smartest, the cleverest civilization in all of Europe, all of it. They brought the first universities to Spain. The very first universities in all of Europe came there because of the Moors. And the Moors was copying what was in Timbuktu, and the Timbuktu was copying what was in Egypt. Yeah, so they brought their educational civilization skills to Spain. And the Black Moors raised up the standards of the Spanish and the Portuguese, and they became the royal family, effectively, because they were like the sultans in charge, and they became the royal families. And that is why the Black royal families, that's one of the sources of the Black royal families of Europe. They were the Black Moors of Spain and of Portugal.
Right.
And so let me share this with you. Just to give you some little bit of evidence, because I want to take you now to the 1700s, because the remnants of this is actually there. What I want to share with the audience in relation to the Moors of Spain. Now remember, this book was written in 1733, yeah? Or probably 1733, and it's talking about the British. All right. This character is called Daniel, the Earl of Nottingham, and he was Secretary of State. He is the eldest son of Mr. Finch, Lord Chancellor, in the reign of King Charles II. So this person's dad used to work for the king, yeah, of England. So let's look at what he looks like, how they're describing him. On page 26, it says here, I'll read it and then I'll show it to you. It says here, in his habit and manners, he's very formal. He is a tall, thin, very black man. And then he goes and say these two words, which is powerful. In his habit and manners, very formal. A tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or Jew. And he's 50 years old. And that's shown right there. In other words, in the 1700s, Jewish people in Europe were black. In the 1700s, Spanish people in Europe were black. Even though they had been kicked out of Spain in 1492, the complexion of their skin was black. So in Europe, in England, sorry, this man who was very black had the appearance of a Jew or a Spaniard. In other words, both these two groups were Moors in the eyes of the English.
Yeah.
And so to go back to the Moors of Spain, the Moors of Spain are Muslim in religion. They're Muslims. The Moors of Europe and rest of Europe are Christians. The black Moors of England and Scotland, whatever, they're Christian. The Moors of Spain and Portugal are Muslims.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the Moors of Spain. Okay, let's talk about the Montague dynasty. Do you understand the Montague dynasty? Could you share some information about them?
Well, let me share this with you. I was of the opinion that names like, my family name is Thomas, your family name is Montague, born in Jamaica. So we come from Jamaicas. We come from a Jamaican kind of a line. And I believed our story was the Kunta Kinte story. I thought it was a case of our ancestor was captured in West Africa. They were brought to the Caribbean, renamed, Montague after the slave master, or Thomas after the slave master. And then we are now carrying those names. That's what I thought until I read this book. Which book did I read? The Secret Memoirs of John Mackey, 1733. And I became confused. I was so discombobulated that I had to literally take myself to the British Library and do some further research. In doing my further research, I realized this book was actually in the British Library, and I actually read the original of this book, and the original of this book is identical to this book. It's identical. So now I know that this book is authentic, even though it kind of is a photocopy. Effectively, it's a photocopy of the original book that's in the British Library that was published in 1733. Now, let me just go to the back of the book so I can find where the Montagues are. Because I honestly assumed that the Jamaican Montagues were basically just the slave children of the slave masters. Right, page 43 is Duke of Montague. That's not the one I'm looking for. Let's have a look. 40.
Well, he'll do for a start.
Okay, it says here, John, Duke of Montague, is a representative of the family of Montague in England. Yeah, and this is during the time of King Charles II. Yeah, John, Duke of Montague. That's what I'm reading here, and it's on page 43.
43, right.
Yeah. And if I go to the back where it describes what he looks like, he says he is a middle stature, inclining to be fat, of a course, and he has a dark complexion. So this Montague, who was part of the aristocratic families of England, had a dark complexion. Not a very black complexion, a dark complexion. So I would suggest that he maybe is brown in appearance. And this is one of the aristocratic members of society. And he is a Montague. So the question is, what happened to the Stuarts and what happened to the Montagues? Well, there was a civil war that took place in England, like I said, and they literally captured all of the rebellious peoples from England, and they brought them to the Caribbean as slaves. But prior to them being brought as slaves, during the time of King James I and King James II, and during the time of King Charles II and King James II, during those times, they were noblemen in the Caribbean and noblemen in America. They were nobles. But when the Stuarts lost power in England, they lost their status in America. That's the first thing. And then during the time of King George III, America decided they wanted independence from England. And when they got their independence from England, all the treaties that the black tribes of America, so what they're calling black Indians, the ones who look like me and you, they look like Snoop Dogg. He was a bit an Indian back in those days. Those people had treaties with James I, James I, Charles II, and James II. They had treaties with the kings of England saying that this piece of land, Louisiana, this piece of land, Virginia, this piece of land is yours. We won't touch it. They had treaties with those kings. When America decided that they were going to fight for independence from England, all of those treaties were thrown in the bin. And all those people who were then called Indians, who look like me and you, they look like Jay-Z, they look like Beyonce, they're these Indians, these are what they would call Negro today. Those were Indians back in those days in America. And those people lost their land and they were turned into slaves.
Right.
So what have I just told you? I've told you three things. I told you one, there were black people in America who was there before the European even turned up. Those black people actually own America, but they got disinherited and dislodged from their situation because of the punch-up that took place in Europe, right? That's the first group. The second group were those Moors, European Moors, who got disinherited, and they got removed out of the European context, and they were brought to America, okay, to go with their brown-faced Americans. Because remember, most Americans were brown-faced by then. So they mixed them all up. These were the European Moors. The Spanish did it first when they moved their Moors out and put them into Brazil and put them into other parts of Southern America, all of America, really. And then you've had the Portuguese did it in Brazil, and the Spanish did it in other parts of America, and and that was in the 1400s. And then later in the 17 and 1800s, the British was doing the same thing, moving them out of Germany and out of England and bringing them to the Americas. And then the third group was the ones who were kidnapped in Africa, and they were brought to the Americas, and they mixed them all up. And so that mixing up meant that the people of America don't know where they come from.
Wow. Okay.
However, if you follow your family name, you can trace yourself back. And so what I found really interesting is that your family has a coat of arms. and your family has a coat of arms when they were black people and aristocratic in Europe.
Mhm.
So you did not get renamed Montague as a consequence of running from Kunta Kinte. That's not your story. Your story is that you were nobility in Britain, in England. You're part of the black nobility of Britain. That's who your family is.
Well,
And
I'm
I
not.
understand, and one thing, and I understand that one of your current family members is actually in the government right now in Jamaica.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of upper class Caribbean people today are really part of the black nobility of Europe. That's who they come from. They're not part of the slave trade of Africa. They're part of the black nobility of Europe who got dispossessed when the black codes kicked in and affected them.
Mhm. Okay, well, I think we should wrap it up there, Miles. That was a
Well,
good.
I hope you found that useful.
I definitely did. There's a lot of information. Sometimes it seems like it's just one chapter. I think that's one chapter out of many chapters that we should do. Because even though you covered quite a lot of information there, I know there's way more. You know, because you can't.
I mean, there is a lot more. I mean, there's a fellow called Mansa Musa, who was the king of Mali. He was a
Mm,
Muslim. It was the African king of Mali during the 1300 AD. Yeah.
yeah.
His uncle, who was the king before him, was Abu Kari II. And Abu Kari II left Mali with over 1,000 ships and went to America to join his people in America.
Mm-hmm.
1300 AD. Christopher
Mm-hmm.
Columbus made that same trip 1492.
Mm-hmm.
And when he turned up, he actually wrote in his diaries that he actually met some Ethiopians living in the Caribbean. So let's go back to definitions. If Christopher Columbus had met me and you, he would write down, I met two Ethiopians. So his word for us is Ethiopians. William Shakespeare's word for us is more.
Mm.
So you might say, but hang on, Ethiopians is in the east of Africa. No, the country called Ethiopia today was called Abyssinia in the past. Ethiopia described brown-faced Africans, all of them.
That's what the word actually means, isn't it? The word actually means brown-faced.
Brown, exactly. So the word Ethiopian meant everybody. So Nigerians were Ethiopians, people of Ghana were Ethiopians, the people of South Africa, they would be Ethiopians. Everybody was Ethiopian. Because what Ethiopian meant was brown-faced people.
Okay. All right then, man. Let's wrap it up there, and hopefully we'll get our friend Dave Murphy to come and join us.
Well,
Be a lovely Dave.
allegedly Dave, I find him a very, very interesting character. And I'm sure if he was here today, he would have given us a little bit more juice and more spice to go with it.
Yeah, but there was plenty juice there anyway. So anyway,
Let me say one more thing. One more thing. And it's in relation to how the Bible stories got themselves entangled with the real stories. Because what I tried to concentrate on was the real stories, not the mythology stories.
right.
But there is a bunch of people who claim to be part of the Hebrew Israelite sort of line. So what I've got here in front of me is a family tree of the characters in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of people attach themselves to. So I'm going to share just quickly. I want to go back to a character that remember I told you there's 3 people who have a religion that dates back to Akhenaten, yeah,
Yeah.
or the ideas he was trying to present. One of them is called Abraham. Muslims call him Ibrahim. The Jews claim he's their ancestor. The Muslims claim he's their ancestor. And the Christians claim he's their ancestor. Because God said, I'm going to make your people, Abraham, rule the world. Yeah? Abraham had 8 children. How many? 8. He had, his first child was called Ishmael, and that was with a maidservant called Hagar. His second child was Isaac, and he had her with his wife called Sarah. And the other 6 children he had with the wife he married after Sarah died, called Keturah. Keturah. So the children of Keturah kind of don't get a mention. The children of Sarah get a mention because because Sarah was his wife. Isaac becomes the legitimate child of Abraham. Yeah. The firstborn legitimate child. So Isaac has 2 children. He has twins. One is called Esau and one is called Jacob. Both those 2 sons get renamed. Esau gets known later on as the Edomites. Jacob gets renowned later on as the Israelites. But here's what I want to share with you. The Jacobites and the Israelites are the same people. Yeah? King James I of England claimed himself to be part of the Jacobites. The Black Scottish tribes of Scotland were the Jacobites. They claim their descent back to Jacob, back to Isaac, back to Abraham. Is it true? I don't know. What I do know, that was their claim. And all of these were Black Scottish Jacobites.
Right.
Yeah. When in Haiti they decided to say no to French atrocities and get rid of them, they were known as the Jacobites or Jacobins because they look like the Scottish people. So the black slaves of Haiti were called the Jacobins. In a book called by C.L.R. James, when he wrote about the story of how they freed themselves from colonization from Europe. Yeah, they were known as the Jacobins or the Jacobites. And the Jacobites were the tribes who then went on to become the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the Jacobites and the Israelites are all the same people. And the Scottish royalty were part of the Jacobites. And the Israelites were clearly a brown-faced tribe. And one of those tribe members is Judah. He was the 4th son. So let me name the tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. Number 1 was Reuben. Number 2 was Simeon. Number 3 was Levi. Levi was the priesthood for the Israelites. Number 4 was Judah. Judah was the king line of those people. The next one was number 4. Number 5 was Dan. Number 6 was Naphtali. Number 7 was Gad. Number 8 was Asher. Number 9 was Issachar. Number 10 was Zebulon. Number 11 was Joseph. And number 12 was Benjamin. And these are the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah gets rebranded the Jews. The Jewish people are the children of Judah. Yeah. So even though Judah himself is an Israelite, his children go on to say that they're Jews. They're Judahites. Yeah. All right. So the Europeans who claim to be Jews today, they're not related to those people genetically. They're not related. They came from another stock who converted to Judaism in around 1000 AD, and they were known as the Khazarian tribe. These Khazarian tribes are today's European Jews. They're the children of them, not the children of Abraham. So the children of Abraham are the black Jews of Africa, the black Jews of Europe, and the black Jews of America. That's who they are. The white Jew and the black Jews of Spain, by the way. The white Jews were the Germanic tribes, and the who came from the Caucasus Mountains and moved around. They were the Ashkenaz. They were the Khazarians, who we think are called the Ashkenazis in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
That European Jew is not genetically connected, but they're the Jews today. So when that book said that the Jews in 1700 were black, because they were.
Mm-hmm.
The real Jews are black people. So there's a man who wrote a book called The 13th Tribe of Israel. The 13th Tribe of Israel describes the white European Jews, but the 12 tribes of Israel are the black Jews. Some people call themselves the Hebrew Israelites in America, but that's who they're describing. It's those people.
Right.
I think I should stop talking because I'm going to overwhelm you.
But fantastic for one day's discussion.
Okay, that's perfect. All right, then. You
All
take
right,
care. All right.
thank you.
All right, bye now.